In 1909, a government-linked explorer filed a report describing underground chambers carved into the Grand Canyon walls, mummies, inscriptions, artifacts unlike anything North American archaeology had documented. The Smithsonian said it had no record of any of it. But the Hopi had been describing the same place for generations before anyone wrote a word of it down. What the Hopi tradition actually says, and how precisely it matches the 1909 record, is worth hearing. Stay with me. On the morning of April 5th, 1909, readers of the Arizona Gazette opened their newspaper to something that didn't read like ordinary territorial news. The headline described an archaeological discovery inside the Grand Canyon, and the article that followed wasn't vague. It was specific, in the kind of detail that either comes from direct observation or from someone who had put considerable effort into constructing a believable fiction. The explorer named in the article was G.E. Kincaid. He identified himself as working on a government-sponsored expedition associated with the Smithsonian Institution. He described a cave entrance located hundreds of feet above the Colorado River on an almost vertical cliff face, accessible only by boat along a specific section of the canyon. The entrance, he said, could not be reached by any trail from above. What he described inside was more significant than the location. A central passage extending over 1,000 feet into the rock, with dozens of chambers branching off in every direction. Some chambers contained grain that had somehow remained preserved. Others held pottery, copper tools, weapons, and carved objects that Kincaid described as unlike anything archaeologists had associated with the ancient cultures of the American Southwest. Then the article described mummies, not laid flat in the manner common to North American burial practices, but seated, wrapped, preserved inside the chambers, and on the walls inscriptions, symbols that neither Kincaid nor the expedition's archaeologists could identify or connect to any known pre-contact North American writing system. 4 days later, on April 9th, the Arizona Gazette published a second article. Not a correction, not a clarification. An expansion, more details about the chamber layout, more description of the artifacts, additional observations about the site's depth and extent. The newspaper was not retreating from the story. It was building on it, and then it stopped. No photographs of the chambers were ever published. No artifacts appeared in any museum, with a provenance connecting them to the Grand Canyon expedition. No scientific report followed either article. No university, no institution, no subsequent newspaper picked up the story and followed it to a conclusion. I want to be precise about what that disappearance actually looks like in the record, because there are two ways a story can stop appearing in the news. It can be retracted, corrected, debunked, specifically addressed and dismissed, or it can simply not appear again. No retraction, no debunking, no acknowledgement that it ever required either. The 1909 Grand Canyon story disappeared the second way. It wasn't killed. It was simply not continued. The Smithsonian's position on the story is consistent and has not changed. The institution states it has no record of G.E. Kincaid in any employment capacity. No record of an archaeologist named Professor S.A. Jordan, who was named in the articles as Kincaid's scientific associate. No record of an expedition to the Grand Canyon that matches what the newspaper described. No record of artifacts recovered from such a site entering any collection. For many historians, that institutional denial settled the matter. The story was a newspaper fabrication, a sensational piece of journalism from an era when newspapers occasionally published elaborate fiction alongside ordinary reporting, and this one was more elaborate than most. But there is a detail the institutional denial doesn't address. And it doesn't address it because it predates the newspaper by more than 20 years. Frank Hamilton Cushing arrived at the Hopi Mesas in 1879. He was an ethnographer, working for the Bureau of American Ethnology, the same institutional umbrella under which James Mooney was collecting Cherokee oral traditions that same year. Cushing's fieldwork, with southwestern indigenous peoples would eventually span years and produce some of the most detailed documentation of Hopi and Zuni traditions collected in the 19th century. What concerns us here is specific. In his field notes from the 1880s, documents held in verifiable institutional archives, dated, cross-referenced, and cited in subsequent ethnographic literature, Cushing documented the Hopi ant people tradition in specific detail, not as a creation myth, not as a symbolic cosmology, as a historical account that the Hopi themselves distinguished from their symbolic and ceremonial traditions. What Cushing documented describes intelligent beings living beneath the earth, inside underground chambers, prior to the arrival of the Hopi ancestors in the current world. These beings sheltered the ancestors during catastrophes, during the endings of earlier worlds. They possessed knowledge of the underground environment. They were described across different versions of the tradition as taller than ordinary people, in several accounts as covered in hair, and they were located, specifically and consistently, beneath the canyon. Cushing wrote this down in the 1880s. The Arizona Gazette published its account in 1909. The Hopi didn't read the newspaper and construct a tradition to match it. The tradition came first, documented by a credentialed institutional researcher more than 2 decades before any newspaper story existed. That chronological fact changes the nature of what the 1909 article means. It means that whatever the newspaper was describing, whether an actual discovery or an elaborate fabrication, someone had access to information about an underground world beneath the Grand Canyon that the Hopi had already been preserving for generations. Either Kincaid walked into what the Hopi already knew was there, or whoever constructed the story drew on the same geography the Hopi tradition had always described. Both possibilities point to the same place, and that place, according to both sources, was not empty. I want to spend time on what the Hopi tradition actually says, because the popular summary of the ant people story misses the specific details that make it significant as evidence. The Hopi emergence tradition describes humanity passing through a series of worlds before arriving in the current one. Each earlier world ended through catastrophe. Each time, survivors were guided to safety before eventually emerging into a new age. The current world is not the first, it is the most recent. That framework is shared by many indigenous cosmologies across the Americas, and is often treated by anthropologists as symbolic, as a traditional way of describing the cyclical nature of human experience and cosmic renewal. But the Hopi distinguish between the symbolic content of their traditions and the historical content, and the ant people account is consistently preserved as history, the beings Cushing documented, and that subsequent anthropologists working with Hopi knowledge holders have continued to document across the 20th century, are described in specific physical terms that don't correspond to how the Hopi describe spiritual figures or symbolic entities. They are described as physical, present in a physical location, possessing physical attributes taller than ordinary people, in several versions covered in hair, living inside underground chambers beneath the canyon, possessing knowledge of an underground world that the Hopi ancestors, arriving from the surface, did not have, the Sipapu. The sacred opening through which the ancestors emerged into the current world is described by the Hopi not as a symbolic heaven or spiritual realm, but as a real physical location, connected to the canyon landscape. A place that can, in principle, be pointed to on a map. What the tradition describes happening inside the underground world before that emergence is not incidental to the tradition. It is its historical core. The ancestors lived in underground chambers. The ant people were already there. The ant people sheltered the ancestors, taught them, helped them survive the transitions between worlds, and when the ancestors emerged into the current age, the ant people remained, not departed, not transformed into something else. Remained. That is the detail that most retellings of this tradition omit. The Hopi don't describe the ant people as historical figures whose era has ended. They describe them as inhabitants of a world that continues to exist beneath the surface. A world that sits under the canyon right now, not just in the past. That distinction matters enormously when you set the Hopi account beside the 1909 newspaper. Because Kincaid didn't describe a fossilized civilization. He described what appeared to be an active site, preserved materials, intact chambers, a space that had not been disturbed in the way that abandoned sites are typically disturbed by time and exposure. Two sources, two descriptions of the same geography. Neither one describing something that used to be there. The Smithsonian's denial is the weight that most skeptical analysis of the 1909 story rests on, and I want to engage with that denial seriously, because dismissing it would be as intellectually dishonest as accepting the newspaper account uncritically. The institution says no record of Kincaid exists in any employment capacity, no record of Professor S.A. Jordan in any relevant context, no record of an expedition matching the described parameters. Those statements are real. They come from a real institution with real archival holdings. They deserve to be taken at face value as a description of what the current institutional record contains. But institutional records from 1909 are not complete. This is not a fringe claim. It is an established fact of archival history, acknowledged by institutional historians themselves. The Smithsonian's records from the late 19th and early 20th centuries have significant gaps. Expedition correspondence was inconsistently preserved. Fieldwork was sometimes contracted rather than institutionally employed, leaving no internal personnel record, informal associations with institutional researchers, the kind the newspaper may have been describing when it referenced Smithsonian involvement, would not necessarily produce a file in the central employment record. There's a second contextual detail that I found significant. The Antiquities Act of 1906 had become law 3 years before the newspaper story appeared. That law placed significant archaeological discoveries on federal land, and the Grand Canyon was already under federal protection, under strict government oversight. Any discovery of the scale Kincaid described would have triggered federal jurisdiction, federal documentation requirements, and potentially federal control over public disclosure. In that legal environment, a discovery that someone wanted managed quietly would face institutional pressure toward exactly the kind of silence the record shows. Not a cover story, not an active suppression campaign, simply the practical machinery of federal oversight redirecting what could be disclosed and to whom. I am not saying that's what happened, as I am saying that the institutional context of 1909 makes the absence of a public record less straightforwardly conclusive than it might appear. Then there are the scattered references. Some researchers working on the historical record of this period have reported finding references to a person named G.E. Kincaid in documents unrelated to archaeology, suggesting that whoever bore that name existed as a real person in the period. None of those references connect him to the Grand Canyon expedition, but the complete absence of a person by that name in any period record would be a much stronger argument for fabrication than what the current archive actually shows. What the institutional record shows is a gap, and gaps in archival research have two possible explanations. Either nothing happened that would have produced a record, or something happened that the record does not reflect. Both remain possible. The archive alone cannot distinguish between them. The restricted section of the Grand Canyon that no official explanation has fully accounted for is where this gets specific. Keep watching. Most people who have stood at the canyon's rim have seen a fraction of what the canyon actually contains. The visible landscape, the layered rock walls, the river far below, the trails descending to the inner gorge, represents the accessible surface of a geological system that extends far beyond what any visitor experiences. The Grand Canyon contains thousands of documented caves. The majority of them have never been entered by any researcher or documented by any survey. The Red Wall Limestone Formation, one of the canyon's most prominent and most extensive geological layers, is particularly significant. It is a porous rock type that forms extensive cave networks naturally, and the Grand Canyon's Red Wall Limestone contains cave systems whose full extent has never been mapped. Some of those systems are accessible from the canyon's interior. Many are not. Their entrances are on cliff faces that require specialized rope work or boat access along the Colorado River to reach. This is the geology the 1909 article was describing, when Kincaid said the cave entrance was hundreds of feet above the river, on a nearly vertical cliff face, accessible only by boat. He was describing a location type that exists throughout the canyon's geography. That specific access profile, cliff face, river approach, no trail connection from above, is not unusual in the Red Wall Limestone zone. It describes a significant portion of the canyon's western sections. I want to be clear about what this means and what it doesn't mean. The existence of inaccessible cave systems in the Grand Canyon does not confirm that Kincaid found one of them, but it does mean that the physical geography described in the 1909 article is consistent with documented canyon geology. The article wasn't describing something that couldn't physically exist in that landscape. What it was describing is in a section of the canyon that remains today among the least surveyed. The western sections of the canyon, accessible primarily by river, have received significantly less systematic archaeological survey than the eastern sections reachable by trail. This is documented in the archaeological literature. It is not a suppression claim, it is a resource allocation fact. Survey crews go where access is possible. The areas where access requires river expeditions have simply received less attention. Within that less surveyed region, the National Park Service maintains restricted access zones. Some of these are restricted for stated safety reasons. Unstable terrain, flash flood risk, technical climbing requirements beyond visitor capability. Some are restricted for preservation reasons. Fragile geological formations or documented archaeological sites where visitor presence poses degradation risk. And some are restricted for reasons that the public documentation describes only as resource protection, without specifying what resource is being protected or from what. The specific section of the canyon that corresponds geographically to the 1909 article's location description falls within a restricted access zone. The stated reason for that restriction is, in the official documentation, preservation. What is being preserved is not specified in terms that would allow an independent researcher to evaluate whether the restriction is proportionate to the stated concern. That gap between a stated reason and an explained reason is not evidence of anything in particular. Bureaucratic documentation is frequently imprecise, but it is a gap, and in a story that is made almost entirely of gaps, it belongs in the record. In the year 2000, the Hopi Cultural Preservation Office issued a formal statement. It did not reference the 1909 Arizona Gazette articles. It did not reference G.E. Kincaid or the Smithsonian. It made no claim about underground chambers or mummies or unidentified inscriptions. What it said was this: specific locations within the Grand Canyon are spiritually significant to the Hopi people and are not appropriate for public investigation or visitation. I want to read that carefully. Not appropriate for public investigation. Not, these sites are of historical importance and we ask for respectful treatment. Not, these are sacred places that deserve reverence. Not appropriate for investigation. The distinction between significance and appropriateness is not minor. A site can be significant and still benefit from careful study. Many of the world's most significant cultural heritage sites are studied precisely because of their significance. What the Hopi statement is saying is something different. It is saying that these specific locations should not be investigated. Not that investigation would be disrespectful, not that it would be culturally insensitive. that it would be inappropriate in a more fundamental sense. The word inappropriate in a formal institutional statement from a cultural preservation office carries specific weight. It means this falls outside the category of things that outside investigation should address. It means the question you are asking should not be pursued in the way you are proposing to pursue it. That is not the language of heritage protection in the ordinary sense. It is the language of boundary setting around something that is, in the present tense, active. Now consider the geography. The Hopi statement identifies locations that, based on the spatial relationships described in Hopi traditional knowledge, and the known locations of Hopi sacred sites within the canyon, correspond to the western sections of the canyon, accessible primarily by river. The same sections that the 1909 article described, the same sections that the National Park Service's restricted access zones cover, the same sections that have received the least systematic archaeological survey, 3 separate institutional contexts, a 1909 newspaper, a 20th century federal land management agency, and a 2000 Hopi cultural statement, are all pointing at the same geography and all saying, in their different institutional languages, that access to that geography is limited. The newspaper describes what's there. The federal restriction limits access to it. The Hopi statement says investigation of it is not appropriate. None of those 3 positions references the others. They emerged from different institutions across nearly a century, and they converge on the same set of coordinates. Here is what the accumulated record actually shows. Frank Hamilton Cushing documented the Hopi ant people tradition in the 1880s. He described underground chambers beneath the Grand Canyon, inhabited by beings who were present when the Hopi ancestors arrived, who are not described in the tradition as departed or historical, but as ongoing residents of an underground world that continues to exist. The 1909 Arizona Gazette published a 2-part account of an explorer who described finding underground chambers in the Grand Canyon. Chambers with preserved remains, unidentified inscriptions, and artifacts inconsistent with any known pre-contact North American culture. The Smithsonian has no record of the expedition. The record gaps that produce that absence are documented as real features of 1909 institutional archives. The Grand Canyon contains thousands of caves, the majority never entered. The section of the canyon corresponding geographically to the 1909 description is among the least surveyed and falls within federal restricted access zones whose stated reasons for restriction do not specify what is being protected. In 2000, the Hopi Cultural Preservation Office issued a formal statement that specific locations within the Grand Canyon are not appropriate for public investigation. The statement does not reference the 1909 account. It does not require awareness of it to make sense. It is a statement about present-day reality, about locations that are, as of 2000, still requiring protection from outside investigation. The Hopi tradition does not describe the ant people as a historical civilization that ended. It describes them as present. The 2000 statement protects their location from investigation. The 1909 account may describe what someone found when they arrived at that location without the benefit of the Hopi's understanding of what they were approaching, and the canyon has never answered the question that all 3 of these sources generate. Not what was there, not what used to be there, what is there now. The Hopi statement is still in effect. The caves are still unexplored. The question of what they protect has never been publicly answered.